Thank you. Mr. President, how are you? Thank you so much thank you for joining us. Have a seat. Thank you so much for being here with us. Appreciate it. And I would love maybe just to start, for people who are not as familiar with your track record in Colombia, could you tell us a little bit about sort of what were your environmental goals when you took office, and just tell us a little bit about the legacy that you had hoped to leave behind there.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. It's a great honor for me to be here in this Semaphore World Summit. And let me begin by telling you part of my story. I declared myself an environmentalist very early in my life. My father and my mother were conservationists, so they tried to give us an education where we had in our ethical behavior the protection of nature. So in every single part of my career, I have embraced the environment as a main priority. When I was elected president, I had some commitments, and I want them to happen fast. The first one was to expand the protected areas of Colombia. By the time I arrived in office, it was 13%. We had committed with what was called the 30 by 30, which is to get to 30% by 2030. And as we were facing the pandemic, I told my team, we have to do this earlier. So we worked with scientific community, we worked with the private sector, we worked with international philanthropy, and we were able to get to more than 30% by 2022, 8 years before the measure. And that created something very important in our narrative, which was, yes, we want to be carbon neutral, but we also need to be nature positive. The second thing we did is that in a very polarized political environment in the whole world, we were able to pass the climate action bill unanimously in both houses in Congress. And we were able at that time to put several indicators that would allow Colombia to issue financial products that will bring capital for those nature investments, including that we launched in the New York Stock Exchange, the Colombian Green Taxonomy. And maybe I will make another reference. When we started the administration, the weight of the non-conventional renewable energies in the energy matrix of Colombia was 0.2%. So we wanted to have a market instrument, and that's why we had a double-edged auction, and we passed from 0.2% to almost 20%.
Of renewables in the energy.
Of renewables in the energy matrix.
Yeah.
So I think those were three major things we did, but that put Colombia in a leadership role regionally. And I think today, Colombia is seen as a country of great promises for green ammonia, green hydrogen, but more importantly, for market-driven, nature-based solutions.
Yeah. Can you say a bit about how oil and gas fit into your strategy there? If it's a big exporter of those commodities, and how do you balance domestic oil and gas production with those green goals that you're talking about?
Well, I think that's a great question, because I don't know why we tend to see this debate always as a yin and yang. So it's a debate of opposites, and I think it's a debate of complementarity. And I'm just going to give you three basic facts why Colombia cannot say goodbye to oil and gas without a very long transition. Let me start with this. Oil and gas represent almost 40% of the Colombian exports. It represents almost 35% of all the foreign direct investment in the country. It represents about 25% of tax collections in the country. And at the same time, it is at least 30% of all the market capitalization that we have in the Colombian financial market. So as I used to say, we need to use the richness of the underground to defeat the poverty on the ground. And the nice complementarity is that when you look at the energy matrix of Colombia, almost 85% of the energy matrix that generates electricity and power for the whole country is based on renewables. So it's a very clean energy matrix, and we almost export something close to 60% of the oil and gas we produce, or the oil we produce. So it brings sources that are needed in the country. And when people used to say, how come that you declare yourself an environmentalist, but you have all these policies to keep on working on oil and gas? I said, because energy security, natural security, national security, and human security all have to be seen intertwined. And, which is also something very important, with the oil and gas sector, we were able to create a new narrative and a new vision. For example, Ecopetrol, the national oil and gas company, became the largest auto producer with non-conventional renewables and created a conservation program that protects the rainforest in the country. And we committed to the 1 billion trees, 1 trillion trees initiative launched by Mark Many some time ago. And we committed to plant 180 million trees in Colombia during the term of the presidency. And Ecopetrol was one of the largest leaders in planting trees along the country. So it's not a yin and yang, there's complementarity. And I would finish by saying we have to focus on the discussion on the molecule. And we have to look at solutions, for example, that now are called geological net zero, where there can be reinjection of some of the carbon that has been captured back into the soil. But we cannot see these with ideological premises that only divide instead of focusing on the whole concept of natural and energy security.
Right, because there's been quite a pivot in Colombia with President Petro with respect to this issue. I mean, it's quite a different policy now. Is there some you see some risk there?
Well, I mean, he was in the opposition when I was in government, and I remember all the things he said. And now when I see him in office, I just don't understand how someone can go to the UN and say that oil and gas are less damaging than cocaine, for example. And he did it, I mean, quote unquote. And he said he's going to stop exploration. So when you stop exploration, you're giving the wrong signals to the market. Market moves somewhere else. And now we're paying the cost of a reduction in our reserves. Gas, we're running out of gas. And now he realized that the gas prices went up. So now he's trying to call Qatar to export gas to Colombia. Imagine the cost of importing oil, gas from Qatar. So those decisions are absolutely insane. And I think his own team is telling him, Mr. President, if you shut down the oil and gas, there won't be even a penny to be invested in the environment. And also, when you look at the environmental policies that he has embraced, he, for example, destroyed what we call the Artemis campaign to fight deforestation in the Amazon. Why? Because there's criminal deforestation in the Amazon. We have lost the equivalent of the size of France and Germany or Texas and California in the last 4 decades due to deforestation. And if deforestation were a country, it will be the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So fighting deforestation is the most important thing that we can do in terms of climate policy. Well, it happens that he literally stopped that battle against those criminals. So I just believe, fortunately, that we have elections next year, and unfortunately, he has 1 more year in office.
All right, we'll watch what happens there. We're here, this meeting happening during World Bank and IMF summits here in DC, and we spoke before a little bit about, you know, what do you think would be most helpful from these multilateral development banks for supporting the energy transition, climate adaptation related goals in countries like Colombia? What do they need to do?
Well, as you know, Tim, I spent a great part of my career here in DC working for the Inter-American Development Bank. So I have great respect for the IFIs, and I believe there's a great opportunity. Now, that great opportunity demands clarity on the right financial instruments that can be put at the service, especially in the Global South. I think the Global North has made substantial advancements, but I think the Global South is where the next chapter needs to be focused, and I'm going to give you 2 very strong arguments. There's high debt in the Global South. When you look at the average debt to GDP ratio is pretty high, so that means you have limited fiscal space. And if you have limited fiscal space and you look at what the Global South needs to invest in order to be net zero by 2050, just in the case of Africa, to meet the NDCs to 2030, they have to invest $2.8 trillion, which is something pretty close of what Latin America needs to invest. So is that money going to come from the budget? I don't think so. There's not too much fiscal space. Is it going to come from bilateral donors? I don't think so, especially now considering that Europe is going to invest way more on defense. So I think there's going to be a crowding out of some of the resources that were appropriated for the environment. Is it going to come from philanthropy? Some resources, yes, but they don't have that size. So the only way to mobilize massive amount of capital for net zero and nature positive solutions is through the market. And then the question is, what are the instruments you need? And then that's why I think there are 4 things the countries need to do. 1, we need to make the green taxonomies a model to be implemented by all the countries so that they can clearly demonstrate which are the key indicators that they are going to meet in terms of carbon neutrality and nature positive solutions. Second, you need guarantees because most of the public investments that ought to be done have to take place with the local governments. And what happens is when they ask for a guarantee from the World Bank or the IDB, it is accounted as if it were a loan for the national government. So that's why there's no incentives for the national government to give big amount of money, long-term funding for a specific climate action investments. So that requires guarantees for the local governments that are very well structured, but can create a way of mobilizing capital. The green bonds and the carbon credits and biodiversity credits, but there's something even more interesting that I have been proposing, especially for the IMF. The IMF could incentivize countries to have facilities that for a certain period of time will not be accounted on the fiscal deficit. There could be special investment vehicles to accelerate the climate investments. And obviously, they require great level of monitoring. It requires great level of reporting. But I think it's the only way that we can accelerate what is pending in terms of climate action. Otherwise, by 2030 or 2050, it will be too late, and the cost will be triple what you have to pay today. So I think those are elements that I would love to see the multilaterals this week embracing it with great determination.
Yeah, that's so interesting. A way to hopefully do that without creating a lot more debt for these countries, right? I guess my last question was, we have a COP summit coming up this year in the Amazon, which I think is going to be really exciting. But of course, it's also happening in the sort of background of the U.S. Not really participating in this multilateral climate diplomacy anymore under President Trump. There's a sort of general pull away, I think, from these types of forums. What's your view on the sort of state of global climate diplomacy? What are you hoping to see at COP this year, and how significant is it for the U.S. to not be playing a big role in that process anymore for the time being?
Tim, I've been to many COPs, and there are good COPs and bad COPs. So, with that said, I believe there's an opportunity, and there's a big risk. Let me start with the risk. The risk is that this COP will end up being a whining context from the global south versus the global north. It can easily happen. If that occurs, it will be a lost opportunity. Why? Because for sure there'll be a lot of populists from the global south saying, you know what, we're paying the cost of all this climate destruction that has taken place with the economic expansion of the global north, so you need to pay us more money and more money so that we can do what we have to do. That's the easy possibility, which is quite risky for being a bad COP. Now, if you wanted to make out of COP30 a good COP, I think there are 3 things to be addressed. 1, every single COP, there are too many pledges, too few disbursements. So let's use the whole financial IFI system. Let's also use the market and determine what's the fastest way of disbursing some of those pledges that are to be focused on the 2 main sources of greenhouse gases emissions in the global south: negative use of land deforestation. And obviously, you have a combination of transportation, clean cooking, and the fact that you need to have more cleaner energy matrix. How do you do it? I think there are the four instruments that I mentioned, the guarantees, the taxonomies, the credits, either biodiversity or carbon with more integrity and maybe fair pricing for carbon. And last but not least, how to unleash resources with the local governments. But that would only be possible through these kind of facilities that for a period of 10 years would not be accounted in your fiscal deficit accounts, but will be a scroll account with great transparency, focused on every penny invested in meeting the NDCs. That, if happens, which I see people willing to be advocates of this, will be the great opportunity to be addressed in Brazil.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, see you there. We'll
thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, President Duque. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.